S.S. Gill, a career civil servant, retired as Secretary, Ministry of Information and Broadcasting in 1985. The same year, he was awarded with the prestigious Padma Bhushan. Since his retirement, he has been regularly contributing articles to leading dailies and magazines. He is also the author of The Dynasty, a political biography on the Nehru-Gandhi family. His latest book, The Pathology of Corruption, is highly praised by readers and critics alike and featured as one of the top 10 books of current time. S.S. Gill is a Marxist. His approach towards life, thought, and creative work is full of progressive thrust. In his book, The Pathology of Corruption, he has quoted Sari Mehmet Pasha. Bribery is the beginning and root of all illegality and tyranny, the source and foundation of every sort of disturbance and sedition, the most pervasive of evils and greatest of calamities. In the preface of his book, S.S. Gill says, "Corruption violates public trust and corrodes social capital. In India, it has distorted planning and development process and nullified poverty eradication schemes. In fact, hardly any book has been written in recent times which deals with the subject phenomenon of corruption in a comprehensive manner." Dilip Patgaonkar, a senior journalist and telecaster, interviewed Mr. S.S. Gill on his book, The Pathology of Corruption.
You've touched upon a theme which seems to be a matter of grave concern to the country, and yet there have been some very important public figures, such as the former Prime Minister Chandrasekhar, who says that much to do has been made about corruption, that in fact 5 or 6 or 7% may be corrupt, but the rest are not. Your comment?
I think it's a very unfair comment, and unfair to the victims of corruption at the lower level. You see, moneyed people, they'll get the best of the system in any case, whether the system is corrupt or the system is honest. But in this comment, he is ignoring retail corruption, which hits the common man. After all, you go anywhere, there's so much noise, protest about corruption. What's the reason? It's an all-pervasive phenomena which has percolated our administrative structures everywhere. And to say that it's confined only to 5 or 6% of the people, actually he is talking of the mega corruption. The ministers, the corporate managers and all that, the top bureaucrats. Whereas corruption has to be seen in a much wider concept.
You know, once you go through these 300 pages of the book, the underlying question that one asks is corruption the source or the symptom of the illness afflicting India?
You see, I think it's very difficult to separate the two. Corruption, basically it's a system of a sick society. And there are several reasons why this has come about. For instance, there is a conflict between the system and the ethos. We adopted a democratic system, equality before the rule of law, objectivity, fair play and all that. The subjective element doesn't count at all in this sort of system. But our ethos are primarily feudalistic, patronage, favoritism, nepotism. These are inherent in our ethos. There was a story going around, I may be apocryphal. People used to say that what can VP Singh do? He couldn't give a gas connection to his mother.
That's right.
So I mean, power is seen as a source of patronage. If there is no patronage, there is no power. I mean, these two are inseparable. So there is basically a conflict. Then our social ethics has a lot to do with it, because India's social ethics is much too individualistic. And if I may quote Octavio Paz, that's much before his death, He says, in Hinduism, there is no concept, I mean, this is of course my observation. In Hinduism, there is no concept of Sangha, congregation, Ummah, or Sangat. Self is supreme, and family, community, and society are extensions of the self. Individual salvation is the highest goal. Karma has no social dimension. Even in Krishna's sermons in Bhagavad Gita, says Octavio Paz, there is indifference to the suffering of others. The least we can say is that Krishna preaches a disinterest without philanthropy. He teaches Arjuna how to escape karma and save himself, not how to save others.
In the early part of the book, you suggest that Hindus take a more relaxed view of corruption because unlike other civilizations, no stigma is attached to the pursuit of wealth. And there is a very fine description there also about the Varnashrama, and we'll come that in a minute. But at the same time, you find that while there is no stigma attached to the pursuit of wealth, the affluent are not exactly very popular in our society. And that no matter what people say, there is a rising tide of anger against corruption. So how do these two go together? Because I refer particularly to your use of the word ethos. So the ethos, yes, the ethos does allow for the pursuit of wealth. Hinduism, there's one sentence in that book which intrigued me very much. You say the Hindus take a more relaxed view of human frailties. Now, they do, and yet there is this endemic anger. How do you explain this?
You see, I mean, no ethos is totally integrated. I mean, there are contradictions within a particular concept also. Now, what you are referring to, I am saying that it appears that Satyayug and Ramaraja were only mythological idealizations created to provide an escape from the oppressive contemporary reality. But acceptance of basic human venality, a flexible view of sin, and celebration of wealth made life more bearable for the earthlings in this incredibly wicked world. You see, now the very fact that of the three Purusharthas, wealth is one. So I have compared it to the Christian ethos.
That's right.
Wealth doesn't have that sort of stigma. Here, poverty is not raised to the level of a virtue, asceticism. Of course, you look at Gandhi, I mean, denial and self-abnegation has always been in all cultures very much appreciated, very much venerated. But I am talking in comparative terms, that amongst Hindus, I have taken here three concepts: wealth, sin, and power in the first chapter.
That's right.
And in all three, wealth, Purushartha, is a desirable objective. It's given in the Shastras. So far as sin is concerned, we have no hard and fast concept of sin. Power, of course, there is, because of one's dharma, there is a check on power. That's why we didn't go totally berserk as the Roman civilization went.
Right. But related to this idea is another one which is there in the early parts of the book, namely that the Varnashram had a very specific place for the pursuit of status, of power and wealth. And you say in that particular paragraph that today what has happened is those who possess one of them also want to possess the other two, and hence the distortions that have taken place in our system. But isn't that inevitable?
No, the point I am trying to make is, you see, I am myself very much against caste system, casteism. This came as a surprise to me, that caste has also served as a remarkably constructive role in the polity, in the sense that it leads to separation of powers. Brahmans, you have prestige, you have knowledge, that's all. Kshatriyas, they are the rulers, but they have neither knowledge nor wealth. Then Vaishyas, they have wealth, but they don't aspire for the other two. So these three separate categories do not overlap. Caste separates them altogether. And this separation of powers proved helpful in the earlier times. But now a person who has wealth also wants power. He also wants, person possessing one wants the other two also. This overlap, I think, has led to the confusion of a clear precept of one's role of dharma. Dharma gets totally confused.
What about a large section of the population which enjoys neither status, nor power, nor wealth? What would you expect them to do?
Now this is again the beauty of caste system, that it totally denied access to any of these three resources to a large segment of the population. But so long as Varnashana Dharma was pervasive and accepted, at that time there was no protest at the lower level. And now you see the rise of OBCs, Dalits, and all that. This is the awakening, the protest of the have-nots against a system which kept them out of the goods of life, good things of life.
You say at one point that deceit comes naturally to Hindu gods, and I think that particular 3 or 4 paragraphs are likely to create some controversy. But at the same time, don't you think that there is a very deeply cherished need also to have role models who are upholders of dharma, understood not in this narrow casteist sense, but somewhere where ethics and morality form the basis of any activity that a person indulges in?
No, that's right. What you are saying is, one thing that as it exists, and other the objective, desirable goal.
That's right.
Now, so far as deceit coming, I think we should see it in a text, proper text. In the case of Krishna, Indra, there's so many times they resort to deceit. I have given specific instances.
Yes, precisely.
In fact, Hindu gods are much too human. They have all the human attributes. They enjoy, they flirt around, they have a nice time, but also they serve as role models. But those role models are more effective because they are human also. So they appeal to your concept of humanity. You easily relate to them. But I am talking of, there I have talked of one thing, deceit. Look at the other things. Those are Krishna, Arjuna, Ram. They are tremendous icons of...
I'd like to end this part of the discussion if you'd be kind enough to read this one paragraph which I think sums up your position from 8 May.
It may be seen that right from the early Vedic times, corruption was prevalent in all those spheres of administration and economic activity which offered any scope for graft or fraud. And if you abstract the factor of technology, the modes of corruption and chicanery were as ingenious as they are today. It also means that those glowing accounts of Satyayug and the ancient India being inhabited by virtuous people are all moonshine. However, cynical it may sound, there is some truth in Bertrand Russell's observation that men do as much evil as they can and as much good as they must.
Which brings me to the contemporary situation. In fact, the bulk of the book, nearly 280 pages, is devoted to corruption since independence. And the first question on this score which I'd like to ask is, do you feel that there is a deep and abiding relationship between corruption and the pursuit of political power?
Of course, I have 2 chapters on that subject. There is, but I think we tend to overemphasize it also. For example, at electoral expenses, we attribute a large part of the corruption to electoral expenses. It was true in the beginning, today true to some extent. But there's another important factor, just the love of money, comfort, luxury, wealth. Now look at the ministers who have stashed away crores and crores in foreign banks. Look at the case of Sukharam, 22 suitcases of currency notes lying in his house. And he was not going to use it for political purposes. He was not going to use it for election. Now they are building up their hoard just to have a luxurious life, just to have a cushion for the rainy days, and just to leave something for the
Mr. Gill,
progeny.
you don't need 22 suitcases of cash even to lead a very luxurious life. This is the frightening part of it.
Right,
All right,
sir.
I think 2 or 3 suitcases would have been enough. But anyway, let me move on to your chapter on the Nehru era. There, if I sum up your argument, you say that Nehru himself was the very symbol of probity, a person above any kind of tainted life. But yet he turned a blind eye, or chose to turn a blind eye, to cases of corruption around him. I think something of that same echo you find also in Narasimha Rao's Insider, that from the very first years this happened. My first question therefore to you is it your feeling that we inherited the hardware of democracy in terms of legislatures, parliament, judiciary, etc., but that the software, which is civic virtue, which is a certain concept of citizenship, that wasn't there at all in 1947?
Dalip, it came as a bit of a surprise to me during my research to find that even in 1947, corruption was perceived as the greatest threat to the polity. I never realized it. For example, in 1947, Radhakrishnan says, unless we destroy corruption in high places, root out every trace of nepotism, love of power, profiteering and black marketing, which have spoiled the good name of this country in recent times, we will not be able to raise the standard of efficiency and administration, as well as the production and distribution of goods of life. It's 47. Jinnah again in 47. At that time, I mean, he was perceiving the whole thing as India, Pakistan as India. One of the biggest curses from which India is suffering is bribery. And we must put that down with an iron hand, and I hope that you will take adequate measures as soon as possible for this assembly to do so. Sanjeev Ayya, you see, he says, congressmen who were paupers in 1947 are now millionaires and multimillionaires. They own palatial buildings, factories, without having any ostensible sources of such income. So this is the situation in 47. Similarly, Gorawala report and other things. So even in 1947, corruption was a very major issue. I think Nehru's fault was he didn't perceive it in the correct perspective. Being so totally honest, and money had no lure for him, he did not realize what sort of fatal fascination it can have for others. So whenever anything came to his notice, in case of corruption, he said, "Chodo kuch nahi, choti baat hai." Not realize.
3 or 4 scandals of that period
Yes.
which you discuss in detail. I mean, beginning in 48 with the Jeep
Krishna
scandal,
Menon, yes.
the Krishna Menon thing, then the Mundra scandal which came, right down to Pratap Singh Kairo,
Yes, yes.
Bakshi, K.D. Malviya, and so on and so forth. But then you move on to the Indira Gandhi era, and there corruption assumes a different and a more venal face. And the burden of that particular chapter is there is a greater degree of institutionalization of corruption, and perhaps also greater degree of legitimacy that is lent to this phenomenon. To what extent do you attribute this to the fact that political power became so completely centralized during that period?
You see, corruption during Nehru era and Indira Gandhi era are very different types of corruption. During Nehru's time, it was a nuisance we just tolerated. During Indira's time, it was a means to power. You see, in 1969, she realized that the purse strings are held by the syndicate chaps. She couldn't select her own people for the elections. She could not have the money she wanted. And she was totally helpless. And she won entirely on her own in 67. But still, she learned 3 lessons. Number 1, she must control the party machine. Must be the president, or president should be her nominee. Number 2, she must control the chief ministers. And number 3, she must build up her own war chest to fight elections and be independent. I mean, she was very particular to be independent.
What about pliant bureaucrats and a pliant judiciary?
You see, those people, because of their interest in their career, lend themselves to that sort of mechanism. But then, you see, Indira Gandhi by herself was not corrupt in a limited sense. She, I think, never used a tainted penny in her own interest. She was a person of very frugal habits, and she hated ostentation. But for her, corruption which she institutionalized, the chief ministers had to send regular contributions. The businessmen had to give contributions. Later on, I mean, the foreign contracts, they were made sources of contributions. This was a planned move to build up her war chest. And that's how, because it became such an pervasive phenomena, she institutionalized it. The methods she employed. And little did she realize that this is corroding the very institutional basis of the polity.
And all these methods, of course, were in full bloom, so to speak, during the emergency.
Yes. They got much worse. You see, in the first phase of emergency, she tried to improve things, to eradicate corruption. But then the very dynamics of emergency was such that you gave absolute power to minions, to small bureaucrats, to politicians, and then they started abusing it, and it became a horrible affair, and she didn't know how to get out of it. She got into a jam, and she didn't know how to get out of it.
That's probably because even the kind of reports that he got from the intelligence source and so on were themselves so tainted.
Yes, yes. That has always been so, you know. I think intelligence reports, whichever prime minister has depended on intelligence reports has come to grief.
I'd like to switch to something entirely different. At the jacket of your book, there is a sentence which will, I'm sure, draw a lot of attention, where you say that Nehru, the cleanest of them all, legitimized corruption by its extreme tolerance among his ministers. Indira Gandhi institutionalized it in the process of building a war chest, as you've just mentioned. Rajiv Gandhi himself faced corruption charges, and P.V. Narasimha Rao is being prosecuted in 3 corruption cases. And then comes the last sentence, which sends a shiver up the spine. One only hopes that the next full-term Prime Minister does not rule this country from Tihar jail.
Dilip, it was meant to send a shiver down your spine. We must realize the path we are treading. We means the political class, the bureaucracy, the corporate world, the path they are treading. Roman Empire was destroyed by corruption. Regimes after regimes have been destroyed by corruption. And I think unless we take very serious note of it and come up with very drastic measures to contain and to reduce the level of corruption, it will destroy the polity.
You yourself don't propose too many drastic measures. I mean, the one criticism I would certainly make of your book is that towards the end, in fact, the last chapter, the last 2 paragraphs, say that what is required is greater transparency and more empowerment. Is that enough? I mean, let me be very blunt with you. You have professed to be a Marxist, and as a Marxist, one would have thought that you would lay greater emphasis on things like land reforms, the elimination of illiteracy, making the citizenry aware of its rights. I mean, that this would be a far better way of doing it, where of course empowerment would be a sine qua non. But these things don't figure. Am I wrong in saying that you've minimized the importance of these factors?
No, I don't minimize. You see, one is the larger social canvas, where literacy, land reforms, etc., they are very important. I mean, I have devoted whole chapters to these subjects in my earlier book, The Dynasty.
Your first book was The Dynasty. Your second book is The Pathology of Corruption. Are you planning a sequel to them?
Not exactly a sequel. I think my next book will be on Gandhi, because I feel that everybody has his own version of Gandhi and has to come to terms with him. I mean, he's a seminal figure. He doesn't let you rest. He spoils the singing of the nightingale. And somehow you have to come to terms with him.
In other words, as someone said, when we are deep in doubt, we go back again and again to the old man.
Yes, we go back to the old man, and then after going back to him, we turn our back on him.
Thank you, Mr. Gill.
Thank you.